After a transcontinental journey of over 10,000 kilometers across the Indian Ocean, the Airbus A350, a technological marvel of the sky, was on its final approach for landing at a Paris airport. However, in a completely unexpected turn, it flew straight into a weather phenomenon considered the most dangerous nemesis in aviation. To make matters worse, at that very moment, the first officer, the one directly in control, suddenly fell into a state of incapacitation. A series of conflict alerts tore through the silence of the cockpit. The captain, with sweat beading on his forehead, became extremely tense. Directly ahead, a Boeing 737 was approaching, getting closer by the second. From air traffic control, a desperate collision warning blared.
711, break away, break away.
The fate of hundreds of souls hung by a thread. To better understand this dramatic chain of events, let us now rewind the cockpit voice recorder and flight data from French B flight number 711. February 4, 2020, San Francisco International Airport. French B flight 711, a scheduled international passenger flight from San Francisco, had completed its final technical checks. It was ready for a journey lasting nearly half a day to Paris-Orly Airport, France. The aircraft in operation was an Airbus A350, one of Airbus's most advanced passenger jetliners. It is the first generation of aircraft in the world featuring a groundbreaking design that uses carbon fiber reinforced polymer for both its fuselage and wing structures. With a modern avionics system, outstanding fuel efficiency, and reduced noise pollution, the A350 is a direct competitor to Boeing's formidable 787 Dreamliner. This particular aircraft was very new, only 2 years old, having been delivered to the low-cost airline French B in 2018. In command was a seasoned flight crew of 13 members, 10 flight attendants and 3 pilots. The captain of the flight, a 41-year-old man, had 8,000 flight hours, with 2,000 of them on the A350. He had joined French B in 2017 and was promoted to captain in June 2019. The first officer, a 45-year-old man, had a total of 8,600 flight hours, including 1,200 on the A350, and had been recruited 18 months prior after excelling in a competency assessment. Because this was a long-haul flight of over 11 hours, in addition to the 2 main pilots, a 50-year-old female relief pilot with an impressive 11,700 flight hours sat in the jump seat. Of those hours, she had 3,400 on the A350. At 5 a.m., with the cabin and cockpit ready, Flight 711 received clearance for takeoff. The autopilot was engaged, and the A350 operated smoothly, quickly climbing to its cruising altitude of 41,000 feet. The flight proceeded as expected. The pilots took turns resting to maintain peak physical condition. On the final leg of the journey, the first officer took on the role of pilot flying (PF), while the captain served as the pilot monitoring (PM). The destination, Paris-Orly Airport, had 3 active runways, with runway 25. Equipped for an instrument landing system (ILS) approach, and runway 24 used for departures. This parallel layout posed a potential risk if an aircraft approaching runway 25 failed its approach and had to perform a go-around. It could collide with an aircraft taking off from runway 24. Consequently, a strict standard go-around procedure was established. If an approach is unsuccessful, the aircraft must maintain a straight course until reaching an altitude of 700 feet, then turn left at a maximum speed of 342 kilometers per hour. After clearing the airport area, it would climb to and maintain 2,000 feet, awaiting further instructions from Air Traffic Control (ATC). After a long flight of over 10 hours, at 16:16, Flight 711 was cleared to descend. About 30 minutes before landing, First Officer began preparations and briefed the crew on the approach. The weather radar at this time showed a thick cloud layer at 4,500 feet, with a light wind from the northwest. Overall, these were quite favorable conditions for landing. 1620 Flight 711 began communication with the airport control tower.
Orly, this is French B711. Hello 711, runway 25 is ready for you.
The Airbus, using an ILS approach for runway 25, gently passed through the clouds at 4,500 feet and steadily descended. After nearly half a day in the air, the crew and passengers could finally see the airport in the distance. Everything was perfect. The crew's remaining task was simply to execute a smooth landing, after which they would enjoy a few days of rest in Paris. However, it seemed things were a bit too easy. Seeking a challenge and an opportunity to sharpen his skills, the first officer proposed to fly the final approach manually. The captain agreed. At an altitude of 1,400 feet, the autopilot was disengaged. Everything seemed under control, but just 4 seconds later, at 1,350 feet, a shrill warning sound shattered the silence of the cockpit.
Wind shear. Wind shear.
This is considered one of the most dangerous weather phenomena in aviation, especially during takeoff and landing. The sudden and violent changes in wind direction and speed can cause even the most stable aircraft to lose stability, leading to a catastrophic accident. In 1985, a Delta Airlines Lockheed L-1011 encountered a microburst while landing, causing the plane to crash and explode, claiming 136 lives. The investigation report concluded that the pilots had unknowingly flown into a thunderstorm where the microburst formed, causing them to completely lose control. If you still doubt the power of these invisible winds, BOAC Flight 911 in Japan is a second tragic example. In 1966, a Boeing 707 carrying 113 passengers and 11 crew members departed from Haneda for Hong Kong. Many pilots leaving Tokyo would often make a detour to give their passengers a closer look at Mount Fuji. The captain of Flight 911 was no exception. He steered his aircraft close to the rooftop of Japan. And right there, disaster struck. The powerful winds around the mountain created fierce vortices that tore apart the aircraft's tail and engines. The B707 broke up, falling from the sky like a leaf, and there were no survivors. Returning to Flight 711, the crew was stunned for a few seconds. There had been absolutely no prior warning of severe weather. The sudden onset of wind shear completely altered their plans, drastically increasing their workload and psychological pressure. To respond, the captain immediately gave the order, "Go around." He abort the landing and circle around.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have encountered a minor weather-related issue. The aircraft is performing a go-around and will be landing as soon as possible.
The first officer confirmed the command. However, in this critical moment, something terrible happened. In just a few short seconds, the stress and sudden overload caused his mind to go blank, and he entered a state of temporary situational incapacitation, a horrifying reality that no one else in the cockpit was aware of. The first officer was still the one in direct control of the aircraft. 1622, he began to pitch the aircraft's nose up to an 8-degree angle and push the thrust levers to the TO/GA, takeoff/go-around, position. He had completely forgotten that he had disengaged the autopilot. Meanwhile, the captain made a call to air traffic control, informing them they were going around due to wind shear.
Paris Orly, this is 711. We are aborting the approach and executing
a go-around. To assist the first officer, the captain set the target altitude to 2,000 feet in the Flight Management System, FMS. Initially, the system continuously provided flight director cues, but even though he was flying manually, the Airbus inexplicably began to drift to the right of the designated flight path. The system repeatedly issued warnings, but the first officer completely ignored them. The captain, busy retracting the flaps, began to feel that something was amiss. Suddenly, an overspeed warning blared. Both the captain and the relief pilot realized that at this rate, they would soon exceed the maximum go-around altitude of 2,000 feet. They repeatedly called out to the first officer, urging him to stabilize the Airbus, but he did not react. Just over half a minute after the wind shear alert, the aircraft had surpassed 2,000 feet and was still climbing. The first officer still offered no response. He just kept pulling the aircraft higher. The altitude alert chimed incessantly. About 24 seconds after the aircraft reached a limit of 2,750 feet, the first officer finally nudged his side stick, momentarily leveling the plane. At the same time, the captain pulled the altitude selection knob on the control panel, an action commanding the computer to initiate a descent back to the preset 2,000 feet. The FMS was still commanding a left turn to follow the go-around procedure. However, because the first officer was still flying manually, nothing happened. The A350 continued straight ahead. It had flown past the runway 25 threshold and was now severely off course. Air traffic control immediately issued a command.
711, left turn heading 180, immediately. We are at 3,000 feet and descending.
Roger, left turn heading 180. ATC confirmed, while simultaneously issuing an urgent warning that another flight was preparing for takeoff from runway 24. It was a Boeing 737 from KLM, the national airline of the Netherlands, only about 6.4 kilometers away. This flight would take off and fly directly into the conflicting path of 711. 1624, the KLM 737 was cleared for takeoff as per standard procedure. Inside the Airbus cockpit, the captain entered a heading of 180 degrees into the computer. The flight director cues immediately appeared, but once again, the first officer did nothing. He just sat there, flying straight towards the conflicting traffic. This was the moment the captain decided he had to seize control. About 52 seconds after the aircraft overshot its assigned altitude, the captain engaged autopilot 1. In theory, the aircraft should have started turning to follow the flight plan. But the captain could not have anticipated that, at that exact moment, the first officer, without a word, reached out and deployed the speed brakes. The A350's speed dropped rapidly, down to just 324 kilometers per hour. The low energy warning immediately roared to life in the cockpit.
Speed.
This action completely stunned the captain. He quickly set a target speed of 480 kilometers per hour and pushed the thrust levers to the TO/GA position to generate maximum thrust, while also retracting the speed brakes. The reversion to manual control had disconnected the autopilot. The captain was now flying without monitoring, in a dangerous low-speed situation. Once again, ATC called urgently, 711, continue your left turn, heading 180 to avoid traffic. 711, do you copy? But there was no reply. The captain was overwhelmed, juggling too many problems at once. In the control tower, the short-term conflict alert, STC, flashed red continuously. Flight 711 and the KLM flight were on a collision course. Ironically, in the cockpit, the pilots were unaware of this, as the distance was not yet close enough for the aircraft's TCAS, traffic collision avoidance system, to issue a resolution advisory. The memory of the 2002 Uberlingen mid-air collision seemed about to be replayed. From a distance, the captain saw the Boeing. He desperately tried to push his aircraft down to 2,000 feet as quickly as possible. The vertical separation between the two aircraft was now only 75 feet, about 23 meters. After heart-stopping seconds, thankfully, the captain's decisive action paid off. The two flight paths did not converge. The Boeing and the Airbus had narrowly avoided a mid-air collision. Immediately after evading the 737 in an unbelievable maneuver, the captain requested vectors from ATC for another landing approach. Throughout this process, the relief pilot in the jump seat repeatedly urged the two men to re-engage the autopilot to reduce the workload. By now, the first officer seemed to be more lucid. He once again acted unilaterally, reaching over to change the flight's heading and activating autopilot 2. This action was never communicated to the captain. The captain was astounded to see on his display that the autopilot was on, and instead of a heading of 180 degrees, the aircraft was turning to 228 degrees. At this point, his composure finally broke. He shouted,
"Everyone be quiet. I am the only one giving orders in this cockpit."
He immediately disconnected autopilot 2 and re-engaged autopilot 1. The Airbus continued to descend to 1,550 feet before the captain once again disconnected it. He took the side stick to begin climbing the aircraft again. 1728. The captain called air traffic control and reported he was making the left turn to a heading of 180 degrees as instructed. ATC confirmed and cleared Flight 711 to climb to 3,000 feet. The captain acknowledged, set the new target altitude, and finally, completed the turn to 180 degrees safely. The first officer turned to the captain, stating he was ready to resume his duties and would take on the role of pilot monitoring, leaving the captain with full control. 4 terrifying minutes had passed since the wind shear warning. The aircraft stabilized at 3,000 feet. Soon after, they were provided with radar vectors for a second ILS approach to runway 25. This time, Flight 711 landed normally without any further incident. Immediately upon deplaning, the captain was furious about the first officer's conduct and reported the incident. He suspected his colleague might have been under the influence of a substance or something that caused his incapacitation. France's Bureau of Inquiry and Analysis for Civil Aviation Safety, B, immediately launched an investigation. During questioning, the first officer admitted that there were moments when his mind went completely blank, although he himself was not aware of this situation at the time. He had no memory of his erroneous actions after the flight. He even made statements to defend himself, claiming he never heard the warnings from the captain or the relief pilot. The BEA issued its final conclusion. Due to the surprise of the sudden go-around and the stress of intense focus on the task, the first officer suffered a loss of situational awareness for a brief period. This corresponds to a type of cognitive overload, where the brain temporarily freezes under extreme pressure. Fortunately, the captain recognized the problem and responded in time. This is a classic example of the importance of crew resource management, CRM. In many cases, if the interaction among crew members in the cockpit is nearly non-existent, and if the captain is complacent and only reacts when the situation has become critical, a mid-air collision could very well have occurred.